What can I say about the philosophy of death? Well, depends on that. I have been asked this by a lot of people who perceive death as a unit, a being. Because culturally speaking, numerous cultures around the world have been evolving or living around this idea that death has to be this kind of entity, this harvester that liberates beings from, from their current existence. And there are even people who went through frustrations that this harvester did not come when they wanted. See, life and this cosmos do not function by one's whims. They do not function based on how someone feels or what one wants to feel. Yes? If someone wants their demise sooner, there are means for that, but preferably not to be performed because nothing happens without repercussions. See, the problem with logics is that people forget one most important thing. Meaning is not something to be taken too literally or too seriously, because when it comes to meaning, meaning will create logics. Yes, because any kind of meaning that people will create through their mind must follow logics. But the problem is, it will follow their own logics. Irrespective of whose logics they will follow, the problem is they follow logics. Logics are always strong when they stand for that which they have been created, yes? But they always become feeble once they become stretched. Let's discuss this a bit about in terms of the philosophical aspect of death. See, death is in many cultures presented as an entity that moves around knowing exactly when to strike or when to peacefully take someone away. See, this is already a difference. Some people believe that death is something that will snatch them away from everything that they have created. For example, narcissists. Other people will simply embrace it because they know that it is inevitable. In the end, death, whatever way you want to portray it as, is nothing else but an inevitable aspect and the only thing that we know for sure will happen. In other respects, one can have control over certain things of their life or not at all, but decisions, for example, are something that give us the only power that we have. Whether someone will find someone to marry, whether someone will have children, or other things like that. These are variables in life that we have some control over. Others, maybe we cannot control. Yes, sometimes someone's demise is not something that happens personally because of age. It happens because of accidents or of other people or of, well, events in general. When it comes to this idea of death, it's not like suddenly, this idea of death being someone who works a job can actually be feasible to people who are well used to this corporatist way of life. Like death being someone who, patiently waits for someone's time to go up and then, they have to pop up at their place and liberate them from their physical body. You can make some interesting animations with that. I've actually seen some of them. But the problem begins when you invest emotion into things that should not necessarily be invested emotions. Because while you can end up with some awesome creations, the problem is they can end up distorting reality. The problem with a concept, yet again, is that it relies on someone's logics. While some other people can borrow logics, which requires them to have a certain level of understanding of the world, others can simply easily be inflicted those logics upon or forced upon in their brains, much like, for example, schooling, teaching, and the such can do. Yes? Schooling systems can impose ideas or can help people understand certain things. Schooling systems in a sick society usually will choose to make everything logical so that people either live a simple life where everything seems logical or where they are eternally confused. The mind, anyways, is confused because the mind only creates a structure. Yes, the life of that structure is your meaning. Yes, that which you give it to it. Because in the end, you can compare this, for example, with your car. Your car has a physical structure, obviously, and a function. It moves forwards and backwards. You can steer it around, which takes extra time, but in the end, it has one simple function. It takes you wherever you want. And that is the point. Yes, it is a vehicle. Whether you choose it or not, it is your own decision. And where it takes you is where you choose to be taken. You will drive it, yes, just like you invest into a certain concept. A concept that you take from someone else is not necessarily something that you have to take as is, and people in general will adapt something to their own logics, even if logics have their own limitations, and many people kind of forget about those limitations. See, if we are to think logically about death, death as a concept, as a being that harvests souls, let's put it like this, well, let's look at it how it has been portrayed. In video games, it kind of never mattered much. It was used usually as, the player's game ending. Yes, when you die, the game ends, and well, you have the means to start all over. In some games lore, for example, death is the eternal harvester. Like, for example, in games like Disciple, you actually had entities that represented death itself. One was a grave golem that simply took people and reminded them of their death. Others were like some kind of, typical death like beings that simply harvested the living and sent them to the realm of the undead. But if we are to think a bit more about this, death will always be perceived also by experience. Because if you present death to a mystic, they know that it is not an entity, it is simply a fact. It is simply an act that happens when the physicality of your body becomes too feeble to hold life. If you give death to a religious person, they might actually believe that death is something that will come for them, or maybe they will have some tendency towards mysticism and they know that one day, at one moment, they will have to make ready to embrace it. Yes, if you give death as a concept to, I don't know, some LGBT people, they might actually end up thinking or even debating that death as a being might even have a gender. And who knows, if you give them enough time, most likely they'll develop a cult around it that death has, even genders, and maybe there's more of the deaths, and that they may even fuck one another and procreate. Everyone can create all sorts of meanings about something, and in the end, that meaning doesn't necessarily have to portray reality. Yes, that is the feeble part of meaning. Meaning can be a good means of, hiding the hideousness of reality, or the idea that knowledge is not yet acquired. True knowledge is not yet acquired, and well, meaning can be used as something to replace it, as a placeholder. Yes, even if that kind of always plunges into delusions. But everyone has to experience life, and life has to be, well, obviously experienced from all levels and layers of consciousness. If we are to think about death as a being, then, well, we can end up in all sorts of directions. So, cultures present death as a being, but they never specify how many of these beings are there if death would actually end up as a being. Yes, is it just one? Like you have one single Santa Claus that goes around and, gives presents to all children at the same, well, not at the same time, but during the same night? Now, also, you can say that they are advantaged, but by um, the our differences from one place to another, which might make things from a, let's say, pseudoscientific standpoint, it might make Santa Claus as more appealing to children, even to some people, not necessarily children, especially since if we think a bit about it, in a sick society, children, well, a lot of adults, they end up aging up. Their physical body grows up, but unfortunately, things that happened in their childhood still keep them tied to childishness. Yes, they still keep them prisoners of their own issues. Yes, and they still think and act much like children. So when it comes to death, are there more such beings? Then if you talk from a gamer's perspective, can two deaths actually kill one another? Yes. The real question is if they were actually physical beings or beings like that, would it actually be necessary? And the question would be, could they actually touch one another? Much like two black holes, they can't necessarily touch one another because basically they are not necessarily physical. Yes. And in the end, they fuse into one another. Would two deaths fuse into a bigger one? Would it actually be something necessary? This shows the problem when it comes to meaning, because meaning, when it cannot hold onto something palpable, it will simply be capable of being propelled in all possible of directions. But unfortunately, it will only bring pseudoscience, pseudo reality, yes, or shortly said, delusions, yes. Should two deaths actually fight? Will they actually fight? Can they actually kill one another? Because in the end, death brings death. Yes? So the question is, if death walks into a bar and brings death, would they bring another one? See, that is the problem with logics. You can twist and bend them around as much as you will, and they will become very good at something, especially the more focused people are on that. That is what in time builds a culture, for example. Yes? A culture isn't necessarily based on something palpable. Or the future generations might actually start thinking that when they embrace new lifestyles. Yes? Did you know that up till 2 centuries ago, people used to cover mirrors, yes, with blankets before they would go to bed because they knew, even back in those times, maybe they did not have experiences necessarily of the such, but they knew back in the times that mirrors can have negative effects on you just by existing. Yes, they can have a certain negative effect. Nowadays, people will obviously feel uncomfortable to embrace that because everything nowadays is mirror. Your screen has a mirroring surface, your monitor, and everything usually has something like that. With fashion being very important nowadays, much like it was back in the times, but nowadays you have way more means to portray yourself. If you want to make a fashion show out of yourself, screens are also the means to do so. And people back in the times felt a lot of these metaphysical aspects because, well, there wasn't much for them to do other than read a book if they were literate, or, handle their own life and be nothing else than, what was their life other than them fighting their own insecurities and aspects and problems and questions all the time, because there weren't that many distractions that we have nowadays through technology. If they wanted a distraction, they had to build it themselves. A toy, something, a hobby, everything required physical labor. Nowadays, you can download a game and you can simply play it. You don't even need to buy it, you can pirate it, yes? So the point is just that. Knowledge is something that has a palpable aspect to it. Logics doesn't necessarily. Yes, to a stupid person, everything may sound logical because they don't have any foundation of it. Yes? So hopefully this video raised a bit of awareness. You're appreciated, take care, enjoy life. This being said, Ferenc Board signing out.